welcome everyone today. Hopefully the title on the screen is what you're expecting to hear about today. Just to go through some housekeeping with you, the event is being recorded. So as I said earlier, we would really welcome you leaving your cameras on, because it's really nice for the presenters to get a reaction from what they're saying, but equally understand if people don't feel comfortable, because if you are on my screen, you will be on the recording. Please keep your microphone on mute, because that will help with the presenters doing their stuff. It's very off-putting having all these beeps. Apologies. Do use the chat function to ask any questions as you go along, and we will have a Q&A session at the end, and I will go through the questions and ask as many as we can get to. In terms of accessibility, anyone who feels the screen is too small, if you go to the top, there's 3 dots, which I think is called an ellipses. Underneath it says more. If you click on that, you can click on focus on content. That will make the slides bigger for you. Equally, in the drop down menu, there is an option to turn on live captions, so you can do that, although they're not very reliant for someone like me with an accent, because it doesn't always understand me. So they're your options. So we've got some great speakers for you today, so I'm going to just run through the agenda so you know what to expect. We've got Kieran Gilder. Gives a wave, Kieran, who's an assistant inspector at HM Inspectorate of Probation. He'll go through the principles of an effective assessment for Black and mixed heritage boys, and that's based on our standards. And then Maria Jerram, who is an inspector with us. Gives a wave, Maria.
Hello, everybody.
Brilliant. She'll just highlight some questions that will assist people reflect on their practice. And Maria did the thematic inspection of Black and mixed heritage boys, so she will then introduce a couple of examples of effective practice we found during our inspection. And then we have Shelli Green, team leader, and Francesca Fadder-Archibald, practice development manager from Young Hackney. Could you two just say hello or wave? Brilliant. And they're going to provide an overview of their work on assessments and for out of court disposals. And then last but by no means least, we have Jennifer Butler, for operational manager from Lewisham Youth Offending Service. Thank you very much. And she's going to share how they deliver a trauma-informed, anti-racist pre-sentence reports. And then, as I said earlier, there'll be an option for a Q&A session at the end. So that's hopefully what you're expecting to hear. So I shall now hand over to Kieran.
Thanks, Tammy. First off, good afternoon, and it's nice to see a few people in the call who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past from across the country. So where to start? Right, if I ask you, or if I was to ask you what this is a picture of on the screen in front of you, what would you be able to tell me? You might be given a headline. You might say it's photographs on the wall. Maybe it's wallpaper, maybe it's a close-up of a TV, maybe it's a cover of a book. Each, though, for me is an assumption. You might also form different views yourself based on what you can see and what you have in front of you. If I asked about the detail, then if you say it's photographs, could you tell me what they are? You can look through the blur and you can see perhaps what it's saying, perhaps form of view. Possibly people, maybe all my people, there's objects there. Do we know that information? Or is there aspects of it that's missing? So how can we bring that picture into focus? Well, we might want to see it ourselves and make the judgment, or ask the person who took the photo for their perspective, or maybe the person who lives and works where it was taken. Now, if we translate that into our assessments and the work that we undertake, how do we bring a focus to the child's identity and not just deal with the information we first receive? And from HMI Probation's perspective, and our assessment standard, then considering the work undertaken in our perspective in terms of Black and mixed heritage boys at stage, as you can see there, assessments for Black and mixed heritage boys should be well informed, holistic, analytical, personalised, actively involving the child and their parents or carers. That's a big statement, there's no doubt about it, but it encompasses what we do in practice. And in essence, what do we actually mean by this as an inspectorate? In the context of being well informed, then assessment must be evidence-based. This includes being informed by a wide range of sources of information, previous assessments, educational experiences, health, special assessment may be available, speech and language, for example, education, health and care plans, If a child has unfortunately been within a secure state, then considering their experience there and how this is relevant to this current assessment activity. The voice of the child should be present in the assessment. That's integral. And we must exercise professional curiosity. Being holistic, then assessment should consider the child and the systems which impact family, peers, school, extended family, culture, heritage, community. This all plays a part, as the societal factors such as the child's experiences of discrimination and this influencing his or her behaviour, as well as the ability to engage in any disposal or court imposed sentence. Being analytical, then that has to be not just descriptive, there has to be that consideration of the child's patterns of behaviour, the underlying causes, the ability and motivation for change, considering key relationships and strengths and how these will enable and promote desistance. The child's diversity and how disproportionality and discrimination is impacted must also be taken into account for the future as well. For an example, this may include periods of school exclusion, experience of a child's involvement with social care, especially if the child has got lived care experience, and how this has impacted in their trust within state bodies in terms of being able to provide support. Personalisation and being personalised. Then for me, any assessment work's got to be relevant to the child's individual identity, their protected characteristics, any speech and language needs, and linking back to some points previously stated, this includes their personal circumstances, their family and their community. And the assessment should provide a meaningful analysis of how these factors have linked to behaviour and how they can be harnessed to promote desistance. Actively involving the child and their parents or carers. Involvement of parents and families is an important part of the work done with children in the youth justice system. This can enable you to present a more comprehensive understanding of the child's behaviour, incorporating those different perspectives that you've come to understand and know. This will undoubtedly assist future planning and delivery and embedding positive change for the future, as it will be more relevant for the child. I think it's vitally important to be mindful of involving both parents and carers. And from the inspection that Maria led on, we found as an inspector that on occasions the father's views were not sought and perhaps even neglected when they had been sought. Other important points and additional considerations is that balanced focus, structural barriers and engagement. And to consider a balanced focus, practitioners should aim for that balanced focus between desistance, keeping the child and others safe. That balance should be dependent on assessment, and it should feature in thinking, and then dependent on assessment will lead to more of a focus on desistance and a more of a focus on safety, depending on the information available at that particular point in time. And it will most probably fluctuate, there's no getting away from that. And a comparison I would offer, it's like a dimmer switch. It's likely you would dial it up and dial it down based on what's emerging for the child. Structural barriers, we all encounter them, no matter where we are in society. For the child and the family's behaviour, this must be seen in context of structural barriers. For example, the equity of access to services such as education and healthcare, and how this is impacted on the child, increasing their vulnerabilities. Assessment should analyse the impact of these and the outcomes contributing to both planning and delivery of interventions. The impact on the child should be mitigated. Families may not be able to advocate in what is perceived to be a socially acceptable manner as a direct result of discrimination and racial trauma that's been experienced. So do consider the involvement of community organisations and or peers to support and facilitate families to access services by offering both physical and emotional support and attending. And in terms of engagement, avoid that negative and weighted language, such as being hard to reach. Youth justice practitioners must be careful to ensure that concerns around building trust with Black and mixed heritage boys do not become a barrier or an explanation for engagement challenges. During the thematic inspection, in one case where the child had not engaged, the closing comments from the manager on the case file were that the family did not engage due to their Jamaican heritage. There was no consideration of different approaches being employed, or that the youth did consider what could have been done differently. The theme of mistrust of Black and mixed heritage boys and their families was consistent in the thematic inspection. We know that just as involved Black and mixed heritage boys are likely to face multiple barriers: deprivation, discrimination, adverse childhood experiences, intergenerational racism, and the resulting trauma as part of their lived experience. That impact can't be ignored. and practitioners must seek to form positive relationships with both children and families. Therefore, any hesitancy in relation to engagement should be considered in this context in the first instance. This could be addressed by thinking differently around engagement, assuming you have a responsibility to promote engagement, reduce the barriers, promoting transparency, actively engaging the child and their parents and carers, clarifying their understanding, not using jargon, and above all, advocacy, and employing that advocacy, taking time to both hear and to listen. So, Maria, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Thanks for that, and hello, everybody. That's really interesting and helpful information and ideas that Kieran has put forward. But what we found in the inspection was that practitioners often struggle to have these open conversations with children, and that the children themselves, actually, when they think that the worker is coming from a place of real concern and wanting to know, and they're authentic, that actually the children don't find these discussions as difficult sometimes as the practitioners. So that was quite interesting. So some of the things that practitioners really need to think about when they're engaging in conversations with Black and mixed heritage boys is really thinking, they need to get to know the child, and they need to try to be able to see the world from their perspective and the particular challenges that they may feel and they may experience, and also you know, about their history, their background, their ethnicity, their heritage, and cultural norms and values that are important to them. It's important that the worker really understands that, and how that has impacted and how they've been affected by racism, and how that has resulted in how they engage with the world, their worldview, their perception of their place in the world, which really is fundamental to understanding the child's journey into the youth justice system, and particularly really getting under the surface with Black and mixed heritage boys to understand the unique experiences that they will have had, and to connect with that, and that will you know, inform all of the work that you do with them. So how you take it into account? So, you know, what was their schooling like, what experiences they had, access to services, that sort of thing, how they feel within their peer groups, you know, children observing the differences between themselves and their white peers, and how that impacts on their self-esteem, their development, and their perception of the future, actually. So some of the children told us that when workers engaged with them in a really meaningful way, that actually it felt like therapy for them, because sometimes this is the first chance they've ever had to explore some of these really significant life experiences and try to make sense of them with another person. So this is a critical moment for staff when they come into contact with a Black or mixed heritage boy in the youth justice system, and they really need to suspend all ideas, any preconceptions, and open up fully to hearing the experience of the individual child and listening properly and believing what they're being told. It's fundamental to how the child will engage. Thinking about the child's safety and well-being, then you would be considering, practitioners need to consider the sort of insidious impact of racism on the long-term development of the child, and how that impacts on their well-being and the sense of self, but also in some cases where there's an immediate risk to their safety as a result of racism. And we did see some examples of that with the children that we met with. For example, one child was assaulted at college as a result of, you know, he was the only Black child in that placement. And these things really need to be thought about. Where does the child feel safe in the immediate, and also what are the longer term impacts on their emotional and mental well-being of experiences that they've had of discrimination, exclusion, and racism. So when you've had these conversations with the child, I mean, obviously what will happen as a result is that trust will be developed. That's what we found, and children felt that where they had these discussions with their worker, there was a real trust that then did develop, and that enabled them to work together with their worker to think about the interventions that would be appropriate for them, and they were more actively involved in the planning for those interventions as well. Next slide, Tammy. So when we met with practitioners, they spoke about finding this particularly challenging. There was anxiety, there was a fear of getting it wrong, there was a fear that they didn't know enough about the subject. But obviously, when you're working with a child and you have those types of discussions, they will put you right about the subject, and they will help you to understand from their point of view. And for each child, there will be some experiences that are similar, but obviously every single experience will be unique, and the way that it's processed and the impact of it will be unique. And children know when you are coming from a place of genuinely wanting to understand what that has been like for them. So for practitioners, I think it's about reflecting on how confident do you really feel in having these conversations, because the avoidance of them means that the child doesn't get what they need, and it also gives rise to assumptions being made and inaccurate assessments, and the work not being targeted in the right way to engage the child, which then can result in the child being sort of considered to be somebody who doesn't want to engage, or is hard to reach, or whatever the problem can then be placed on the child, who's often experienced this many times before. So that's a real concern and something that needs to be avoided. So I think it is about confidence and being honest with yourself about it, and seeking advice and seeking support, and making sure you have relevant discussions with your manager, and for managers to understand the challenges that staff feel in this area of work, and making sure that they are geared up towards it, asking staff the right questions, providing the right level of support. And similarly, thinking about the training that you've had to really be able to understand what the impact of discrimination has been on children, and what it means for them in the present, and also for them moving forward, and making sure that your learning is embedded, and that you reflect on some of the challenges that you experience both personally yourself in having these discussions, and making sure that you can be open and honest about that, and getting the support that you need. So just moving on now, we're going to have a presentation from Hackney Youth Offending Service, and they are going to tell us, Shelli and Francesca are going to tell us about the out-of-court disposal assessments.
Fabulous. I shall just stop presenting while Shelli, you get your slides up. And just to say to everyone, we did actually speak about this in the effective practice guide that followed on from the Black and Mixed Heritage thematic. So there is more detail there. And also, while you're getting them up, Shelli, Shelli and Francesca have shared a copy of the assessment, which will be circulated after the event to everyone.
Can you see the presentation?
Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'll let Fran begin.
Yeah, I think Tammy has introduced us. So my name is Francesca Fada-Archibald. I'm a young Hackney practice development manager, and I work closely with Shelli and team. And one of my areas of responsibility is what we call prevention and diversion, which is essentially the out-of-court disposals.
Thanks, Fran. So yes, I'm Shelli. I'm the team leader in the prevention and diversion team. So we are situated within the wider Young Hackney Early Help and Prevention Services. So we very much take a youth work approach to our work. We work with all children who are referred to us from the police, either who are arrested or being interviewed, to offer a diversion and support them to kind of prevent further offending ultimately. So in terms of our journey in Hackney, oh, let me see if I can move the slide. Oh, here we go. So in terms of thinking about how we came to this point, we've been operational in our current kind of format within Hackney since 2015. And over that period, we have been collecting data. So we've always kind of collected data in terms of ethnicity, age, types of offences. So we do have a very comprehensive data set, and what we have seen is there are 60 to 80% of young people that we work with that identify as Black or global majority children. I think these statistics unfortunately will be very familiar to many of us in the criminal justice system. We also, unsurprisingly, have a significant number of people who come to us that have either diagnosed or undiagnosed neurological developmental disorders, and particularly speech, language and communication needs. Again, this is not surprising. We typically work with males aged 14 to 17 years old. And again, what we see through looking at our assessments, through looking at the history, looking at the past, looking at the context of this family, is a common and yet complex themes that are consistently identified across the cohort of children that we work with. What we see is, and that these are often linked to structural racism and inequalities. Often we see really traumatic family experiences, exposure to domestic violence, other violence, historic, intergenerational, also not only within the home, but in terms of the community, that extra familial harm. We see parental mental health, substance misuse, lone parents' families, social inequality and economic deprivation. And again, often within our cohort, we see school exclusion and NEET status. So again, these are factors, and they're all vulnerability factors that will be very common to us, and that we understand how they increase that vulnerability to children becoming involved in offending, their decision making, the challenges they face. So we had in 2019, we underwent so how we came to developing our current assessment tool. In 2019, we had a sector-led peer review, and they identified, a number of strengths, but also a number of areas for improvement. Typically, because we had been sat within the wider Young Hackney services, we had the same assessment tool. The peer reviewers identified that we were not really, we weren't really assessing kind of the criminogenic factors. We weren't looking at the pro-desistance factors. We weren't formulating our risk analysis. There were kind of a number of areas for development that the assessment tool wasn't capturing, or we as practitioners needed further training to kind of ensure we do this correctly. So we thought this is an opportunity for us to make an assessment our own and think about the young people that we're working with, and who are those particular children, and how can we meet their needs, and how can we ask these questions. So our tool has underwent a number of refinements. I think we're probably on version 4, version 4 of the tool, but actually that's been really helpful. So I think initially we were thinking about, we wanted an accessible tool. We wanted a tool that was for children and for families, not for practitioners. This isn't about us. This is about that co-production. It's about that collaboration. It's a tool for them. It's for them to tell their story. In respect of the children we see, particularly with speech and language communication needs, we wanted to use simple language. We wanted to use visuals, colours, emojis, because we really wanted to encourage that active participation and have a conversation. We're asking really personal, sensitive information, and we're inviting them to share that, and that can be really difficult. So we wanted to make it as just kind of as open and informal, and that it was their story. So that was probably version 3. And then I think, as we were all aware in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and in kind of the Black Lives Matters process, we had some really deep thinking in our team. It's always a conversation that we've had. If anyone ever gets to meet my team in prevention and diversion, we are incredibly passionate, and particularly we we as practitioners were seeing the racism constantly. We can see it in exclusions. We can see it in arrests. We can see the structural racism that exists. And we were having these conversations within our team and within ourselves, but we weren't having these conversations with our children and with our families. We weren't asking them, what is your lived experience? So I might read it on a police report, I might read it, but we're not having that conversation. And we felt this was a real missed opportunity. So we had to have a lot of thinking as a team about how we were going to approach it. A number of considerations we had to think of. How are children and family going to, I've been referred to for an offence. Why are you talking to me about racism? Also, particularly for our white children and families, how are they going to respond to being asked this question? I think Maria kind of mentioned it, how comfortable to both our white practitioners and our, Black and global majority practitioners, who for them, this could actually, the racialized trauma they might feel, thinking about their own experience, also thinking about their children, and how is it hearing for them, and what mechanisms did we have in place, not only for our children and families, but also for our staff. So after lots of conversations, thinking about how we were going to approach this, we felt we need to just be direct. We need to ask this question. We need to invite people to share their story. Of course, they don't have to. So we thought about adding and explicitly asking children and families about their experiences of racism and discrimination. So version 4, which we are currently in, which you will see later. And yeah, we're going to come on to, we're going to kind of share some of the themes that have come from that a little bit later. Before I move on, I would also need to think about what were we going to do with this information? It isn't only about supporting and improving the outcomes for the Black and mixed heritage children that we work with, but also how we're going to affect and try and influence change in the wider system. We report to the Safer Young Hackney Board. We have a voice as professionals to try and affect change in some of those systems. We've always consistently reported data about the inequality, about the disproportionality that we see. But again, what was missing from those reports is that lived experience. So the information that we've now been collating and collecting, and it's incredibly powerful. We will share some of this with you later. Probably have more influence than I do to kind of affect change in some of those wider systems. So so it's twofold. It isn't just about how we can help children and families, it's how we can affect change more widely in that system that continues to oppress them. Let me move on. Okay, so I'll pass to Fran.
Okay, so these are some of the key practice approaches that we needed to be really versed in and develop. First and foremost, as Shelli referenced, to be very self-aware, and therefore whatever our identity, intersectional identity, to be self-aware of what that is and the power dynamics that we have with the children and the families by virtue of the fact that we are professionals that are coming into their lives and doing an assessment, and reminding ourselves about our clarity of purpose. So why are we doing this assessment, and what do we need to get out of it so that it is meaningful?
They don't even help. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I can hear someone speaking. Maybe they've muted themselves now. So we've spoken about the importance of being trauma sensitive and informed. So meaning that we're not just aware of experiences that might have happened out there in the local area that have impacted on the families that we worked with, but how we then utilize that information and that knowledge in the course of having that assessment conversation and how it informs the intervention thereafter. Thinking of the assessment as a tool for young people and families and children to tell their story, so something that invites participation, and that it is a co-production. So we're not doing an assessment to them, of them, we're doing it with them. So it's that conversation that makes that story shine through. It's about being honest and transparent for us and ourselves and the challenges that we might have in these conversations, but also inviting that from children and realizing that oftentimes children and families might have had experiences of professionals or in life that means that they are perhaps not trusting that honesty and transparency will serve them well. So holding in mind all of that as well. Very important being professionally curious. So we're asking questions not to be nosy, but that professional curiosity that means that we really genuinely want to know what those experiences look like, felt like, what can we do about it, and making sure that we explain to the children and families that we're not there to judge a situation. And then using that assessment to inform the decisions that we make about them. So it's really important to remind that we use this assessment prior to make a decision on the disposal that we give. And that decision is done by a multi-agency panel, and the assessment and the voice of the child and the experience of the family is key to be brought to that assessment and be part of that decision making. Over back to you, Shelli.
Thank you. Before I actually go on to the next bit, you'll have a look at the assessment tool when we share it, and it's actually separated into two sections. We have one where we have the voice of the child, but then there's also a separate section where we're very privy to lots of information when we're thinking about those sources of information, whether it's from education, whether it's from social care, and we're able to kind of reflect and write down separately, aside from what the children and family are telling us. And we can say, actually, we do know about this, and how does that impact you? But it's quite distinct. So we wanted to design the assessment tool to kind of really capture the child's voice, but also in terms of the honesty and transparency about what other information we have, what's our view, what's our understanding. So that was kind of one of the design considerations of the assessment tool. So I'm going to have a disclaimer. I'm going to actually share some of the children's voices with you and the families. So this is information that has been shared with us. It's in their own words, and I'm going to read it out. It is quite powerful. It can be quite difficult to hear. So I just want to share that with you before I do read some of this to you. So this is something, these are what children and family are telling us, really. So this was child A, African Caribbean. It said it's discriminating people because of their background, because of the colour of their skin, thinking they're less than. It's something I've experienced and witnessed. Being a young black man, to me, it means being statistically limited, if that makes sense. People make assumptions, put me at a disadvantage. I've been stopped and searched by police before. When it happens, it doesn't surprise me. The last time it happened was sometime last year. I know a little bit about my rights, but not much. Mother said he's very aware of being a young black boy in Hackney and what that means for him statistically and for his future. So in terms of the outcome, the child requested a session on rights and responsibilities. They wanted to have further conversations and explorations about racism, pride and identity. Mum was really happy to hear that the intervention would also think about all the positive aspects about being a young black male. It's treating people differently and unfairly because of their ethnicity, colour and religion. I've witnessed this when riding across the country with my friend who is mixed race. It felt different, uncomfortable being with him, as I could see that people treated him differently because of his race. I enjoy hearing other people's views on racism. I would like a session on racism to be part of this programme. So in terms of the outcome, the child participated in a session about racism, and we had conversations about how to be an active anti-racist ally. One mother told us every single student has issues with it. We believe she, head teacher, had already stereotyped Black people. I ask her the right questions and she feels challenged by me. So I'm posing questions that she can't reply to. The stigma they have that it's always been as a single parent, Black parents. We don't miss a meeting at school. And she thinks she's never seen that in the Black community. It was new to her. That's my only explanation. Child is our second child to go to the school. We've got no issues with the vice principal. It's a personal thing with the head. So in terms of the outcome, this child wasn't in education. We made a referral to Sendiags, which is a specialist service offering impartial advice to parents with children with special educational needs and disabilities, because we needed to request advocacy in terms of supporting the child back into education. The parents were concerned about challenging the racism they experienced whilst a sibling remained in the school. So we liaised with the Young Hackney team leader who was linked to that school to ascertain, is the sibling known to them? Can we do some work? Can we do some collaborative work and try and identify if there was a way to understand and work with the school to consider that racism experienced by the family? So another child said, I was walking through the park with my friend. I messaged my friend on the estate in Kingsmead. I was on the corner, just thought to have a zoot. On the corner, all I see is a TSG. Man's in sliders with a zoot in his mouth. My eyesight is bad too. From when they came close to man knows it's a TSG. They were backing out tasers and batons like it's nothing. It's just life on the estate. Day in, day out. Police trying to interrupt man. I get mistaken for being older than I am because of my height. I'm 6'4". I look older. Sometimes I look in the mirror and think to myself, I look like someone the police would stop. They took man home and explained it to my mum. I thought it was over and done with. It's obviously quite concerning about the batons and tasers. The child did not wish to make a formal complaint, but he did consent to the police officers querying the nature of the stop and raising the concerns regarding the use of tasers and batons directly with the OIC. So I think you can all agree that's really quite powerful. You know, for me, as I was saying initially, this information is being shared with the Safe Young Hackney board, and we're constantly thinking about how we can improve our services to kind of address these needs and the racism that we see. In terms of improvements and developments, oh, was this me or you, Fran? I can't remember.
It's okay. I can finish it off, Shelli, because I don't know how long we're doing for time, but this is basically the penultimate slide, and the next slide is just about some feedback, so we can finish on this one if we've run out of time.
So 2 minutes.
Thank you. Excellent. So the child's voice, as a result of implementing this assessment and taking this practice approach, the child's voice is much more evident now at all stages of the intervention. This has also generated visible improvements in communicating with police colleagues regarding issues of racism in the context of policing. When we had these conversations before, there was a lot more resistance, and, you know, it was not validated and recognized as much, but this has been not us giving third-hand information about how young people, children are experiencing racism, but the children speaking for themselves about it. It's made the decision-making about disposals more child-focused. I said something about that earlier on. And we're also going to include a recruitment of young people to become out-of-court disposal panel members, so that we can add that voice within the decision-making. This does not obviously replace the voice of the individual child in the assessment, but it gets us to think about their involvement, representing the community and making our decision-making processes more transparent. We've improved on our analysis of risk and of harm, and understanding what are the real harm and trauma that we see, not just some of the things that might be on the surface of the offence incident, but other experiences that are happening concurrently. And then we are working on trying to achieve a bit of consistency, because you can have the best tool in the world, but if you're not using the tool well, then you're still not going to achieve what you hope to achieve. We've improved our analysis and our reporting, because we don't just have quantitative data, we also have a qualitative, rich information and powerful narratives. And we've reported recently to the Safer Young Hackney, as well as sharing this approach with our colleagues in the recent anti-praxis conference that we had last week. And also in terms of the variability of how this tool is used, it's about, like Maria was saying earlier on, having those conversations with the practitioners with their managers, about understanding what questions do we need to ask, what do those look like, do we feel comfortable in asking them, or is there some additional need there in terms of making people feel empowered, comfortable in discussing those issues that can be either triggering or that can be just generally difficult for other reasons. We need to understand a little bit better how racism interfaces with other aspects of discrimination and intersectional disadvantage. And also we need to develop further how children experience victimization. So when we realize that in the past they've been victims, how do we also capture that and make sure that we include that as part of the intervention? And I think that was last, and I think we pass it back over to you, Tammy. This is the young people feedback, but I don't think we've got time to cover it. Is that right?
We haven't, but we can circulate the slides after the event, and then people can read it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll just share my slides and then get Maria to introduce Jennifer. So
thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Shelli and Francesca, for that. One of the other elements of good practice that we identified in the inspection was the work that Lewisham Youth Justice Service have been doing in terms of their anti-racist work and their reviewing of the layout of their pre-sentence reports to consider and tackle inequalities in sentencing. So I'll just hand you over to Jennifer Butler, from Operational Manager from Lewisham Youth Justice Service, who's going to talk us through their work that they've been doing. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer Butler. I'm one of the operational managers at Lewisham Youth Offending Service. I've got over 25 years experience in the youth and adult criminal justice system, and I wrote my first pre-sentence report in 1992. So a little snapshot of my experience with PSRs. So what did Lewisham do differently to implement a trauma-informed, anti-racist restorative approach, TIARA for short? We have a pre-sentence report panel. The PSR panel is an integral part of the process, and as soon as practitioners, report writers are aware that they're completing a PSR, they're given a date to attend the panel. This panel is chaired by me. I have input from the restorative justice officer. I have input from a senior practitioner. The case manager brings the report to the panel, and we go through a document where we address not just the offence, but also the social graces. What are the social graces, I hear you ask? The social graces are the acronym that we use to address gender, race, age, class, education, sexuality. The good thing about those letters is that they can encompass a wide range of diversity considerations, but those are the main ones that we look at when we're addressing the pre-sentence report. We have the discussion around trauma. We are moving towards being a trauma-informed service, and we've been on that journey since 2016. We haven't reached the end of the road yet, because it's a constantly evolving process. So in the pre-sentence report panel, we discuss the adverse childhood experiences that the young person has gone through, and we consider where they are located on the trauma recovery model. I'm going to go on to that in a little bit more detail with the next slide. So this is just a very quick overview of what we've done differently. So in the PSR panel, we then discuss the offence, we discuss the young person as an individual, who are they, and then we look at the risk considerations, and then we come to a conclusion and a recommendation to the court. So as you can see, it's an advice-giving arena. We make sure that our assessments are defensible, and there's a shared ownership and responsibility. It's not just the report writer making that decision in terms of an assessment and a recommendation. And that was really, really key when we had a serious incident arising from a community recommendation that had been put before the court. The court followed our recommendation for a community sentence, because in Lewisham we do not, I emphasise, we do not propose custody. So we had made a recommendation on a very high risk case for a child to be given a community sentence, and unfortunately that child a month later went out and committed a very serious offence. Of course that had ramifications for us across the service, but what we wanted to ensure for the case practitioner who'd written the report, this was not your sole recommendation. This was a joint recommendation made by Lewisham Youth Offending Service. In terms of quality assurance, again, that's very key in the process. Some people use the old language of gatekeeping. I personally don't like that. I don't think it's a professional terminology for the tasks that we as quality assurers are completing. We're quality assuring the report to make sure that it is of a high standard to be put before the reader, i.e. the court, the youth court or the Crown Court. So within our quality assurance process, we ensure that trauma is addressed, that the adverse childhood experiences have been highlighted, that the voice of the child is heard in the report, and that the parent's voice is also heard in the report. So a report author would need to submit that PSR to us ahead of time, 2 days ahead of time, for it to be quality assured sufficiently with any feedback given to the writer. The impact of racism. I was fascinated by Hackney's presentation in terms of addressing structural racism, and also the impact of the George Floyd murder in 2020. That incident also impacted on Lewisham in terms of what could we do differently. And so we looked at how could we address racism and the experience of the child sufficiently in our report. And colleagues, I'll tell you, it hasn't been an easy task. We have had our knuckles rapped by the court because they have told us we have been too political. And again, that's why I say the quality assurance process is very, very important, because if you have a passionate report writer who is advocating anti-racism, who wants to highlight the lived experience of the child, if that's not quality assured to put into, I don't want to use the word sensationalist, hyperbolic language, the reader at the court will not be happy with being told about racism. And so we experienced that in 2020 when we submitted a report like that, and the magistrate said to us on the feedback form, the courts are very mindful about the political circumstances, so we don't need to be told this. Whoa, what a learning point for us as report writers. How we then change that is to make sure that the experience of the child's lived experience of racism is given in their voice, not the voice of the PSR author. We also make use of statements from the Lamy report. So the Lamy report published in 2017, spoke about disproportionality within the criminal justice system, particularly for young Black people in education and also going through the criminal justice system and custody. So we make explicit reference to the Lanny report in our pre-sentence reports. There was also a report published by Beyond Youth Custody. I can't remember the year, I think it might have been 2016. And they gave us some very helpful statistics around the impact of custody for young Black people. So again, we make explicit reference to those documents in our PSRs. We're not submitting the statements chapter and verse. We just make a couple of sentences alluding to the impact of structural and lived racism on the Black child. And I liked Hackney using the term global majority, so I'm going to try and remember to use global majority rather than minority ethnic groups. I'm going to go to the slide about trauma, but we also asked the court to take into account that we are robust in our delivery of the interventions that we're monitoring. They do have concerns that being a trauma-informed service, we're a soft service. No, that's not the case. We have a basis of setting boundaries with the child. We ensure that we are reliable and we ensure that we're consistent. That doesn't necessarily mean we are not going to enforce orders where necessary. I've made reference already to the social graces. It's not in uppercase on this slide, which I do apologise for. And you may think, well, what does that mean? But again, to reiterate, the graces are an acronym for the diversity considerations: gender, religion, I've put in a new one there, religion, age, class, education, sexuality. We've removed the deficit language within pre-sentence reports. So rather than coming from a place of the child is not able to, we replace it with a strengths-based approach. And one of the most straightforward and simplest ways that we did this was just switching the format of the PSR slightly. So whereas your normal, usual pre-sentence report would start off with the introduction, the offence analysis, the assessment of the young person, or in some instances, the assessment of the offender, then talk about the risk assessment and the conclusion. We made one simple change by switching the assessment of the young person to the beginning of the report. And the impact of that has been quite significant, because not only does it locate the child as being a child in front of the court, it's also been helpful for the report writer to start off with the story of who the child is rather than what the offence is. So all of Lewisham's pre-sentence reports start off with the assessment of the young person. And again, as Hackney said, it's constantly being reviewed. And in order to fully implement the child first approach, we're going to move to the assessment of the child. So what then the reader sees in that is, here is little Johnny or little Jane in front of me, rather than this child has committed a robbery. We try to have a positive opening statement for that child. So it would be little Johnny has settled into his school and has attended every single day. Or little Jane has settled into her placement and she hasn't had any missing episodes. Just a simple sentence of positivity for the child roots that child in front of the court into something more than an offender. So that was really key and a very simple shift in terms of report writing. In relation to concordance rates, what we saw from 2019 was a positive concordance rate, but in terms of the Black and global majority children, that concordance rate was 87.5%. Number of factors could have played into that, but there was a clear distinction between that group of children and the white children. In 2021, our concordance rate for Black and global majority children has increased to 91%. So there is a shift, there is a change, and it's moving in the right direction, but there's still more ways to go. Next slide, please, Tammy. So I've made a lot of reference to the trauma-informed service and the trauma-informed statement. As you know, judges, magistrates don't like very lengthy reports, and this looks like a lot of information. However, we do condense it. And the beauty of this statement is that it can be used anywhere within the report. So you could use it in the assessment of the young person, or you could use it in the conclusion. More often we use it in the conclusion of the report as we're moving towards our recommendation. I'm pleased to say that I have seen this statement used from a service external to Lewisham, so it's really pleasing to see that the trauma-informed model is gaining traction across England. So to read it out, we tell the court that we're a trained trauma-informed service, which looks holistically at all areas of the young people and their families' lives. And we observe where they are on the trauma recovery model. We attach a physical copy of that trauma recovery model to all of our pre-sentence reports. So when the magistrate reads that, or the judge reads that, they can flick to the back of the report and have a visual image of that trauma recovery model. And then we advise them that the model is rooted in research, and it does look at the impact of trauma and how this affects children and young people's behaviour. And again, this section here about we're not minimising the offence, and we are taking into account risk and the serious issues which are associated with the offence. So this statement is included in all of our pre-sentence reports. Next slide, please, Tammy. So when we're thinking about Black, Asian and ethnic minorities, or as we say today, global majority, the sentencing guidelines do give very specific definitions on what can be used. And so this statement that there's evidence to suggest that Black and minority ethnic children and young people are overrepresented is something that can be attached to pre-sentence reports. We discussed this at length in Lewisham, whether we should use this as a given on all of the pre-sentence reports. However, the concern for us around this statement and using it across the piece was that magistrates, judges, the readers of the report would become immune to the statement. And so we wanted to make it more bespoke to the child, to the individual in front of the court. So we will use this statement in a modified format, depending on the nature of the report, but we wouldn't put it wholeheartedly or in this context on the front of all of the reports. I think in terms of practice across the piece, it's something for all of the youth offending services to consider how they want to use this statement in the pre-sentence report. Next slide, please, Tammy. And finally, the overarching principles. This is a given, one would say, that we use the overarching principles for sentencing youth. However, it's not all of the courts, particularly the Crown courts, that are familiar with the overarching principles of sentencing youth. And if you are sending a number of pre-sentence reports to the Crown Court, this is something that you should include in the report to support the judges, to support your recommendation, and to emphasise that this is a child who is being sentenced in the Crown Court. My slide has disappeared. Thank you, Tammy. So as I said, in Lewisham, we do not recommend custody in our pre-sentence reports. If we're not able to propose a viable and robust community sentence, we tell the court that, but we do not make the recommendation for custody, particularly when the vast majority of our cases are Black and global majority children. We would be making custody recommendations more frequently than not. So yeah, I would emphasise using the overarching principles. And when I had a discussion with the legal advisor at the local court, the local youth court, I was advised that this is something that we should be emphasising in our youth court reports as well, because not all of the magistrates are familiar with sentencing youths. This is the final slide, but one of the things that we did do was put on a number of training events for the magistrates at our local youth court. So we had a training event on speech, language and communication needs, but also in 2021, we delivered virtual training to the magistrates about the trauma recovery model so that they are aware and familiar with the practice of Lewisham Youth Offending Service. So that's it from me, Tammy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I do think it's genius just swapping those things around, and thank you to all the speakers. Really interesting and lots of stuff to get us thinking. So we do now have 15 minutes left for you to ask any questions, and we can do that, either pop them in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, pop your hand up and ask away. I'm going to stop the recording so people might feel freer to ask the questions.